ever feel like, I don't know, maybe you're standing at the edge of this huge, like vast desert of information. It's exciting, but kind of overwhelming, you know?
Yeah.
Where do you even begin?
I know that feeling.
Right. So that's where this deep dive comes in, sort of your guide. Today we're trekking into some unexpected territory, the desert, but as a spiritual guide. We're talking about early Christian monks, the desert monastics.
And how they use that environment, their actual surroundings, to reach a whole other level of, well, spiritual understanding.
Exactly. It's like counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
We've got these excerpts from an academic paper. It's called Earth, Water, and Fire, 3 Classical Elements of Desert Spirituality.
Catchy title.
Right. And honestly, it was mind-blowing. These monks weren't just surviving out there. They were using the desert, like earth, water, fire, almost as spiritual teachers.
Like the desert itself was this living classroom or something, always pushing them to reflect and grow.
Okay, so earth seems basic. I know, dirt, sand, big rib, right? But then this paper throws in this story about St. Anthony, like desert monk superstar.
Yeah, kind of the poster child for that whole movement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Anthony has this vision of a monk just weaving rope. And the paper saying that simple act, that's the key to salvation. Salvation through rope. I was like, what is going on here?
It's more about the how than the what, if that makes sense. See, for them, working with your hands, like that repetitive action, it wasn't just practical. It quieted the mind. And that was crucial.
You're saying it's like the focus it took to weave, that created the mental space they needed for deeper prayer, for that connection with the divine.
You got it. And it wasn't just weaving either. Any kind of work, they applied this to it. There's this other story, a blind monk refused help even to get water because his work was that important.
Wow. Dedication is an understatement.
Mm.
But I get it. You know, like if your work is tied into your spiritual practice, that's powerful. It makes you think about like, what does it mean to find meaning in what we do every day?
Absolutely. They were all about that mind-body connection. So even like fetching water, it wasn't just a chore. It was part of something bigger.
Okay, that's making me look at my to-do list a little differently now. Speaking of necessities, can we talk about water for a sec? This paper, it really drives home how scarce and precious it was in the desert.
Yeah, just reading it, you start to feel that thirst almost.
For real.
And that's exactly why it takes on such a deep meaning for these monks. Water wasn't just about physical thirst. It was this powerful symbol for how much they relied on God. It's like, imagine you're totally dependent on something, right?
Yeah.
Like you need it, but you have very little control over it. And for them, that was water. But that feeling, that yearning, it also reflected their relationship with the divine.
So every sip of water wasn't just like quenching their thirst. It was this reminder of something way bigger.
Exactly. A reminder that they were reliant on something beyond themselves. And speaking of unexpected sources, there's this incredible story about St. Macarius, you know?
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about him. He's the one who had that encounter with the...
With the mirage, right. He's lost in the desert, dying of thirst, and he sees this woman offering him water. But get this. It's not the mirage that saves him. A buffalo shows up and nurses him back to health.
A buffalo. You can't make this stuff up. It's like the desert was full of these like mythical encounters for these monks.
Totally. And it wasn't just random. It was all about how they saw God and everything. Each drop of water, every weird encounter, it all pointed back to their faith.
Right, like it deepened their belief, solidified it or something. But it wasn't all crazy miracles, was it? The paper also talked about water in this quieter sense, like how, over time, dripping water can carve a path through rock, that slow, persistent erosion.
Oh, absolutely. They were really into that metaphor. Because just like water slowly shapes stone, they believed that consistently doing spiritual practices could lead to some serious inner transformation.
So it's not about these big sudden overhauls. It's more like the small everyday stuff over time adds up to real change.
Nailed it. There's this great quote in the paper from Abba Poman, one of the Desert Fathers. He said, "The nature of water is soft, that of stone is hard. But if a bottle is hung above the stone, allowing the water to fall drop by drop, it wears away the stone. So it is with the word of God. It is soft, and our heart is hard. But the man who hears the word of God often opens his heart to the fear of God."
I love that image, that steady drip, changing something that seems impossible to change.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered earth, we've covered water, ready to get fired up.
Let's do it. What about fire?
Fire has always seemed super symbolic, you know, especially in religion, like awe-inspiring but kind of scary too, right? But what I found so interesting in this paper was how these monks connected fire to their everyday lives, to their inner world. It wasn't just this far-off symbol, It was immediate and personal.
100%. And a big part of that was their whole thing about becoming all flame, intense.
Right, flame. It feels active, like you're being shaped by it, always in the middle of it.
Yeah.
You can't just sit there. You got to move, got to stay active to survive out there, you know?
Totally. And it wasn't just about like purifying themselves as individuals either. Remember how we were talking about water, how it reflected their need for God? Well, fire, that represented the divine light they believed was inside all of us. The more they refined themselves, the brighter it burned.
And that inner light, it wasn't just a metaphor for them, right? The paper talks about monks actually emitting light, like literally. There's a story about Abba Arsenius. He appears as a pillar of fire to some visitor.
Whoa. Can you imagine?
Seriously. So are we talking like a literal thing here?
Well, whether it was literal or not, the point is, these monks, they believed holiness was something real, something you could actually see in a person. Like the more spiritually pure you were, the more it showed.
So it's like their faith, their connection to the divine, it actually had an outward effect. It changed things around them.
Absolutely. And there's that story about Saint Seraphim, a monk from way later on, who supposedly glowed when he prayed. Now, whether or not we take that literally today, it shows you how powerful that idea was for them. The idea that being connected to something bigger than yourself could make the ordinary extraordinary.
I gotta say, the whole glowing thing, that's a bit much for me. But I do like the message, you know, that what's going on inside of us, our spiritual side, it can make a difference in the real world.
Exactly. And they didn't think that inner fire was just going to happen on its own, you know. It took effort. It took discipline. But it wasn't just about willpower either. A big part of it was surrender, allowing yourself to be open to something bigger.
So it's kind of a balance then. You're working at it, but also letting go at the same time.
That's a great way to put it. And this is something we can all relate to, right? We all go through tough times, those metaphorical fires, in our own lives. And I think that's what makes these desert monks so relevant even today. They were dealing with some intense stuff, and they learned to not just survive, but to thrive in those conditions.
They learned to adapt, like those desert plants that survive with hardly any water.
Exactly. And just like those deserts are full of life, if you know where to look, the monks believe that even in those really tough situations, there's always the potential for growth, for transformation.
So as we wrap up our little desert adventure here, what's the biggest takeaway? If we had to sum up what we've learned from these desert monastics, what would it be?
For me, it's that you don't have to live in a literal desert to learn from it, you know? These monks, they used what was around them, the earth, the water, the fire, to understand their spirituality. It reminds us that we're surrounded by opportunities to connect with something bigger, something beyond ourselves, if we just open ourselves up to it.
It makes you think, what about in our everyday lives? What do we see all the time, but maybe we're not really seeing it? What if we started looking at those ordinary things as chances to connect more deeply with ourselves, with the world, well, maybe even with something sacred, something to think about, right?
Absolutely. That's the beauty of it. There's always more to learn.